Two Paths to Florida is really a study on how genealogy helped unite two families. Okay, so this is the story of both families' journeys through the Holocaust. My family was part of avoidance and escape. And the second family that we'll get to is involvement and partial survival. Both occurred with an amazing set of coincidences and also a lot of luck. At the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you're going to see it like a little tool thing, and that's what that's going to do is to display where the information came from, or where I reference the information to come up with this story. On the top left-hand corner, although you can't see it now, you will see a date of the year of where this when this is occurring, and on the top right-hand corner there'll be a little flag to indicate which country this particular action happened. Okay, so in going through the presentation, we're going to see a number of entities and people that are discovered during the research. The first thing is a Swedish church which was dedicated to saving Jews, a Galician and Jewish adventurer in Australia, a future Prime Minister of Israel, a family of righteous Gentiles in Krakow, a future high-ranking clergyman of the Roman Catholic Church, a French parliamentary deputy, and also a Scandinavian king and a Schindler's List survivor. So these are the people and the places that are bumped into during the research and during the research of both families. So the Two Paths to Florida consist of these two paths. The first path is my path, which is the refugees from Europe, which is the Sturz family from Vienna and Galicia. And there I am with my parents and with my grandparents, my paternal grandparents. And path number two is going to be the people that were trapped in Europe. This is the Perlmutter family from Krakow. And the person that is my second cousin is Max. You can see him here at 6 years old. You see him here at 72. So when it all started was in 1980, when my father came to visit us when we were living in Canada, and I said, you know what, I'd really be interested in the tree of all the people that you know. Tell me all the people that you know in the family. And so he said, okay, here it is. Grandparents, these are the parents, these are the cousins. And then I said, thank you very much. And I took a 20-year rest. So after 20 years were up, I had loaded my name, my family name, into the Jewish Gen Family Finder out on the Jewish Gen site. And the name was Sturz. And one day I get an email from someone called Simon Stewart, sends me an email and says, you know what, tell me about the Sturz family, tell me about your parents, grandparents, and so forth. And that's how we found that all of a sudden that there was a connection between him and me at the grandparent level. So at the grandparent level, we've got 7 brothers and sisters of my grandfather. And I was, of course, the grandson of my grandfather, who was the oldest of the brothers and sisters. And we were, at that point in time, were living in Pennsylvania. The Simon and Carol, Simon was the guy who sent me the email. His parents, or his grandparent, was Jacob Sturz, who was a brother of my grandfather, and he lived in Israel but was born in England, and his sister was born in Israel but lives in England. So all of a sudden now, with just one email, I found that I had two second cousins that I really knew nothing about whatsoever. Then there was another second cousin who was Max, and Max was a grandchild of Lieber Sturz, who was a sister of my grandfather, and he lived in Florida at the time. Not knowing that, we got in touch with each other, and all of a sudden now I had one extra second cousin. Now, the children of Mendel Sturz and his wife were all illegitimate. At least that's what they said in Poland. Why were they illegitimate? Well, here's my grandfather's birth certificate. And I'm fortunate to have a lot of documentation from both sides of the family, as you'll see as we go forward. And on this grandfather's birth certificate, there was a column which said "Nieszczudny," I guess that's close as I can come in Polish, which means illegitimate. Then there was another notation put on the bottom of that birth certificate, which says the parents were legally married in Krakow on December 10, 1893, and as a result, their son Burl, my grandfather, is pronounced a legitimate child, and that was done in 1899, just before the wedding of my grandfather to his wife, to my grandmother. Just in time. So here's an overview of the first path, which is the escape from the Holocaust, which is my family's escape. And it all starts off in Vienna in 1938, and my parents were able to get to Melbourne, and that's where I was born during the Second World War in 1942. And then I continued on in 1967, which was just after I managed to get a passport. Unfortunately, fortunately, the war was over, but I got the passport in order to go to Israel. But it took longer to get the passport than the war lasted. So rather than doing anything else right now, I just said, fine, I'm going to go to, from a business perspective, I was in the computer field. I'm going to go to Toronto, and got there in 1967. And we moved with my wife, whom I met in Toronto, and our two kids to Philadelphia in 1980. And then in 2006, we moved down to Boynton Beach, Florida, which is about an hour north of Miami on the East Coast. My family's origin was mainly in Galicia, Austria-Hungary. That's all the blue boxes. On my grandmother's side, my father's side, they were from Vienna. And then there's the lone Australian down here, and also a lone Canadian, which is my wife, because she's of Canadian ancestry. Here's a brief history of Galicia. It was ruled by Poland in 1387 to 1772. And between 1772 and 1918, it became a crown land of the Austrian Empire. And then after that, since they got all broken up during the Second World War and the subsequent, it now is divided between southern Poland and western Ukraine. A lot of people have asked me, well, why did all this happen in Galicia? My answer is, it actually happened all over Europe. And if you just give me 30 seconds now, I'm going to run this film, which is going to tell you what happens. And if you look at the top left-hand corner of the screen, you will see the year that the countries change, and you'll see how often Europe's countries changed in 270 years. Now, aren't you happy that Australia doesn't go through that turmoil, or many other places where we live? But that's the way it worked. I've also done a little more with my DNA and gone and had some DNA analyses done. And what I've found is, as a result of this DNA analysis, that a lot of my relatives, going back maybe 4 or 5 generations, all emanate from Eastern Europe. So it's significant that they come out of Belarus and Lithuania and Moldova. This is my my great-great-grandfather, 4th great-grandfather, Simcha Sturts, who was born in 1767. And then all these other colors here are how many steps away the other people that I've found on my tree are. So all these relatives come from this area over here. I went a bit further, and through National Geographic, they have a genographic project. And when you load your DNA into their project, then it tells you, it goes back and shows you for your particular haplogroup where it originated and where the people went, where the migration was into Europe and so forth. So, as I say, my people 60,000 years ago migrated to Europe via Jericho. Isn't that nice? You know, we've been to Jericho. And I was fortunate enough also to actually go to Louis Leakey's discoveries at the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania several years ago when I was doing an African trip. And there they show some footprints that they have dated out 3.5 million years. So that's where I found my origin 3.5 million years ago in Tanzania.
Near me.
Okay, so now we're in 1938, and my parents were still in Vienna. They were not living in their regular apartment. I'll explain that in a minute. And on June the 30th, 1938, my father received this note from his employer, Bernard Botwin, and he was a jeweler, a jewelry store. My father was a jeweler also, and his father were all jewelers. And it says, on request of the NSDAP, you are hereby dismissed without notice. They're starting to clean the Jews out of commerce. And that was sent to my parents' address, which is Wien, the 9th district, Zeegasse 16, Swedish Society of Israel. Now, this was something that my parents mentioned to me almost in passing, because they really didn't talk about anything that happened in Vienna and Austria. I got all my information from research rather than from what they related to me. So the Swedish Society, or the Swedish Mission in Vienna, was this building. And it still stands there now. And this is a photo that I took when I was in Vienna a few years back. It's in 1922, the Evangelical Church in Vienna acquired the house and named it the Swedish Society of Israel. In 1938, the Nazis forced a name change, and they now called it Stockholm Swedish Mission, Vienna, but it was allowed to continue. And the reason it was allowed to continue is that it served as an immigration office with food, housing, and utilities, and as a refuge for the destitute and persecuted, and saved about 3,000 Jews and Christians of Jewish descent, which the Nazis were very gladly allowed to be moved abroad, so they didn't have to deal with it. That's why they kept on. They allowed the mission to continue. From Google, and actually this came from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the there's a chart which was made by the Nazis, which showed the immigration or the banishment of Jews from Austria. That's what's called the Ostmark, is what the Germans called Austria. So in 1938, there were 160,000 Jews in Austria. And in 1941, there were only 30,984 Jews left. But 1,771 were emigrated to Australia. This was their chart. They were very meticulous in tracking the Jews, how many were left, how many they had to exterminate, and so forth. So in Vienna, my parents get a letter from the Commonwealth of Australia on July the 21st, 1938, which allows them to emigrate. That's their approval to emigrate. And the sponsor was a man called Mr. W.W. Schaumer, M.M. Schaumer. Now, I didn't know who he was, but we always referred to him as Cousin Morris for reasons that I'll get to in a second. So in leaving Vienna, here's the paperwork, and it says Mr. Schaumer is the sponsor, and it says that my father is a cousin of Maurice Schaumer. Picture of my parents at the train station in Vienna on their way to get on a ship to go to Australia, and my grandfather and grandmother, who were standing next to them, were not in that group. So my parents at that point in time didn't know whether they'd ever see their parents or my father's parents again afterwards. That was a very interesting picture that I managed to dig out of what I had. They arrived in Australia on November the 1st, 1938, which was Melbourne Cup Day, which my father always reminded me that it was very important that it was Melbourne Cup Day, not that we ever bet on anything. So here's Cousin Morris, or Maurice Morris. We called him Morris. He was a sort of an adventurer. He left Krakow in the 1890s for Australia. He was partners in a jewelry business in Melbourne in the 1900s. He was the manager or the owner of a pearling outfit up in northwestern Australia and Broome in the 1910s. He actually was an opal miner in Coober Pedy in South Australia in 1920. He died in Melbourne in 1952. Now, he wasn't a cousin. It turns out that he was just a friend of my grandfather. And we found that out at the end of the 90s when we were visiting Maurice's grandchildren, that we surmised that there was absolutely no blood relation. There was no relation whatsoever by marriage, by blood or otherwise. So it was just a matter of they happened to find him in Australia, and he then sponsored my parents to go to Australia and escape the Nazis in 1938. This was Cousin Morris's passport. It was a one-page. In 1895, that's all you needed. It was something was typed out, because he kept on going back between England and Australia many times in that period of time that he was working as a jeweler and having jewelry business and so on. He was back and forth all the time. So what did he do? He had a jewelry business in Melbourne in 2003. He was the partner of a business that was doing pearling up in Broome. He was an opal miner in Coober Pedy, and just before he died, he summoned me to his house, which was only about 200 yards from where my parents were living, where we're all living, and gave me some souvenirs. And these are opalized snails and mussels and tree trunk and so on that he dug up in Coober Pedy when he was working there. Died in 1952. Immediately that my parents got to Australia, they immediately applied to get my grandparents over. So on January 24, 39, which was only 2 months after they arrived in Melbourne, Commonwealth of Australia sent a letter to my grandparents and said, you're in. And they arrived in Australia in April of 1939. As I said, my father and my grandfather were jewelers, manufacturing jewelers, and this was a relief of my grandfather that he made out of silver, which I still have now. It's very precious. I didn't know that there were prenup agreements that existed outside of California, Dov, but there was one. Certainly, there was one back in 1899, and my grandparents had a prenup agreement. And I got it translated once, but I don't remember any of the contents of it. It's about 7 pages long, and that made sure that if there was a divorce or whatever, that whoever got into the marriage took out what they put in. Registered before they got married in 1899. Then it's me. So I came along in 1942. Here's a photo of me with grandma and grandpa in 43, with my mother and with my father. And then my parents were naturalized in 1944, and they had their name anglicized to Stewart with that spelling from their Austrian or German spelling of Sturz. And you'll see also later on that another part of the family, quite independently, also changed their name from Sturz to the same spelling as Stewart without either family knowing. So in 1967, I arrived in Toronto. I married Elaine in 1971. And then we had about 26 children, actually only 2. But I did collect their school photos from every year so they can see how they progressed. And quite a change from there to there, and it's worse now. And then on to Philadelphia in 1980. Our 2 paths merge in 2005. So now we're going to go over to the second path, which is my second cousin, Max, and his family. So where it starts off, we have Max, who's the second cousin. We have Amalia, which is Max's mother, and we have Max's sister, Lucy. And Max's father is shown down here because he wasn't at home when the war broke out. So what happened is that he left Krakow and was on a business trip. The war broke out, and he couldn't get back into Poland again at that point. And then the story picks up from there. He got a Canadian passport or a Canadian visa in 1943, and he went to New York. On the way to Canada, jumped ship, and stayed in the U.S. Unfortunately, Max's mother died in the Holocaust in 41, and Max's sister Lucy died in 45. Max, when the war was over, Max first went to Sweden in 1946. Was able to find his father in 1946 in New York, and I'll get to the details of that later on. And then in 2003, he and his wife moved down to Boynton Beach, which is why we moved to Boynton Beach. So here is Max at age 72, at age 13, and at age 6. Here are the characters in Max's family. William, or Wilhelm, the father had a law degree. He was the captain of a Maccabean soccer team. He was also the founder and president of Boss International, which is a beef and cattle purveyor for Europe and the Middle East. And he was on one of his trips when the war broke out, and then he couldn't get back again. Amalia, or Miriam, was the daughter of a prosperous wholesale baker and inherited a large apartment building, which was their family home. Lucy was 14 years old and had a wide circle of friends. And Max was the son. And there was also a woman called Honka, or Hannah. She was a peasant. She didn't have a family. She was a governess and became superintendent of their apartment building. And the reason why I bring it up here is because she played a part further along. When we went to Krakow, maybe 5-6 years ago, we went to the building where it was very close to the center of Krakow, and this was the building that Max's family occupied up here on the 3rd floor, and the grandparents were on the 2nd floor. I don't know who was on the 1st floor, and then there was, I think there was a bakery. This was a bakery as well. Or could have been, but right now the building still stands, built in 1905. It still stands right now, and we're able to go to the outside of it and see where Max lived. So war breaks out in September 39, and Max's father Wilhelm is in Paris, and he was barred from Poland. He couldn't get to Poland, but he did make his way to Lisbon. Amelia, Lucy, and Max are still in Krakow. But what they do when the war started was they flee to Radymno, which is about 140 miles by train. They bought themselves passage on in a boxcar and got to a house which was owned by a friend of Max's father. There's Uncle Natek and Aunt Helena, which is also in Max's family group. And he was a pharmacist, and he got himself a wagon and horse team and headed east to try and escape the Nazis. Jesus. When they get to Radymno on their way east, they get there after dark. And unfortunately, the superintendent of the building is unaware that there are any visitors upstairs. And so they just continue to go with their son onto Russia. And Helena died later on in 1944 of cancer. And Natek, who was the uncle of Max, he died in 1984. Leonard still survives right now, and he's the only second cousin that I have not yet met. Then there's great Uncle Jacob and Uncle Eddie. Now that's from Simon and Carol. Simon was the second cousin that got a hold of me, and we made the connection. So the great Uncle Jacob and Uncle Eddie, they were in a Polish army. They had signed up for the Polish army, and they were sent by the Russians to Palestine. And they also passed by Radymno. They passed the house, and again, the superintendent was still unaware of Amalia and Lucy and Max that were upstairs, so they both continued into the east. Jacob dies in England in 1961. Uncle Eddie, however, served in the British 8th Army fighting Rommel in Africa, and he's pictured here with someone that you may not recognize, but you will when you see the name. Menachem Begin was in this photo with Eddie Sturz in 1942. He died in England in 1984. Okay, so in October of 39, which was just a month after the war started, Max and Amalia and Lucy were in Rodimno, and things were getting bad there, and they decided that they got to move. So they hired a wagon and they fled 15 miles to the west, sheltered in the cellar of a house with 15 other people. In the morning, the house was on fire and everyone fled into the nearby swamps. Now, the problem with that is that there was no food. And so they went to a railway and they returned back to the apartment in Krakow. So now they're back in the apartment. The total time between when they left and when they got back was about six weeks. In 1940, the Nazis started getting nastier and nastier and said, "You've got to share. You've got to get out of that apartment and go and live somewhere else." So they were forced to move to a room. After 4 to 5 months, they were told, "Leave Krakow or go to the ghetto." So they found a small room in Borek Faleki, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, which is a small Jewish community outside of Krakow. And they hired a tutor for Max twice a week. So we're in 1940 at this point in time. In the meantime, Wilhelm in Lisbon secured papers. He's got the papers for his family to get out of Poland. The problem was that he couldn't get into Poland to give it to him. So the passport or the visa, I guess it says passport here, the passport was noted for all countries outside of Europe as well as for Brazil. And there's also a special visa for Shanghai. But again, because of the fact that he couldn't get this paperwork to them, and even if he did, they wouldn't be allowed to leave, that was a wasted effort on his part. There were all sorts of postcards and letters that went from the family to Lisbon. Here's Wilhelm Perlmutter in Lisboa, and it came from Borek Faleki, which was where the family was staying in that room. So the postcards just kept on coming back and forth. And here's a postcard from Max, even written in Polish, to his father, but they had no opportunity to see each other, and eventually those letters and postcards stopped. Then they were forced to move to the Krakow ghetto, and they had to move in with another aunt and uncle called Aunt Gittel and Uncle Noah. And the room or the apartment that they moved into was actually in the Krakow ghetto, which was where the aunt and uncle were living at the time. And when you look at it in terms of the ghetto itself, you could see that here is where their building was, and it's inside the ghetto area of Krakow at Weglerska 10. Multiple families were in that apartment, so you can imagine how crowded it was for all the families in that confined space. The relative distances between where they used to live in the apartment and the room where they had to stay in Borek Faleki was about 4 miles. And right in the middle of that was the Krakow ghetto. And very close to that also was the Plazau concentration camp. Max became a smuggler. They got him to get in and out of the 3 gates that were open to the outside world, and he slipped in and out of the ghetto and brought back, so we say, goods, whatever that is, food, medicine, that type of thing. Honka, or Hannah, who was in the old apartment, that was the governess and the manager of the building, superintendent of the building, was the contact on the outside. And one time Max got caught coming back in again, and the Germans scared the hell out of him. So he said, oh, no, there's no way I'm ever going to do that again. And so his smuggling days were over. On June the 1st, 1942, the Germans conduct Aktion Krakow. And what that means is that they're going to line up as many people as they can and take them to Belzec. 7,000 people went out that day, and that included Max's mother. She was included in that group. However, Lucy, who was Max's sister, and Max and Manya, who was a cousin, they hid in the house. And fortunately, a few days later, Lucy sends Max to Basya. You don't know who Basya is yet. Basya Celeste was a friend of Max's Aunt Gittel. And she was an actress, a Roman Catholic. She was single, and she lived with her parents. Basya also is in the underground, and she works as a seamstress for a Nazi commandant. And Amalia, Max's mother, once asked her, if Hitler comes, please save my youngest child. So Max is hidden by Basya. He gets a birth certificate. He gets his name changed, his date of birth changed. He now becomes Tadeusz Czarnik, or Teddy Black, and becomes Basya's nephew. And also, he is noted on another form as being Roman Catholic, and they lived in an apartment called on Paula Poplea 6, which is significant in a minute. Max is schooled by Basya's parents in that apartment, and at one point he has to act like a deaf child for a few weeks because they were scared that he would open his mouth and people that came to visit may find out that either he was Jewish or it wasn't a nephew or whatever it was. So he had to act as a deaf child whenever anyone came into the house. After several close calls, the family moved out to a villa on the edge of Krakow called Walla Jastowa. One of Basya's and her family's close friends in the apartment building was this man. He was a laborer and an actor. And his name was Karol Joseph Wojtyla, the future Pope Paul II. Lived in an adjacent apartment. The villa was a few miles out of Krakow. It was previously the summer residence of the president of the Bank of Poland. And I think this was the one that I managed to capture. They're still standing. There were 3 families in the villa. There was no running water, but Max was allowed run around in the garden, but he had to stay clear of the road, which was where the Germans were.
Yes. Oh. Yes.
On July the 22nd in 1944, the Germans conduct mass executions. And there was a field opposite the villa, which is now is built out. The Germans execute many people in those fields opposite the villa. Unfortunately, Max was a witness to that. But Basya's father, who knew some German, invited some of the Germans into coffee. Max was told to go out and weed in the garden and keep quiet, and the German officer comes up to him. He doesn't look up, and so the family is spared. So what they managed to do was to make friends with the Germans so that they would not, in fact, themselves be executed. And it looks like that they were acting in league with the Germans. On January the 18th in 1945, the Russians liberate Krakow. The artillery sounds become louder. The Russians stop in front of the house and they eliminate the Germans. And one of the things that Max told me is that the way they eliminated them was to lay them on the road and then run a tank over them.
Oh.
I thought you'd like that. The house becomes a local headquarters now for the Russians. Captain Nikolai is sympathetic and coexists with the family. And in February 45, the family moves back to their apartment. So in 1939, we're now going over to where Wilhelm was, what his journey was. That's Max's father. He was in Paris when the war broke out in Poland. He buys a car and he doesn't register it. He drives other refugees, including the people called Golopta from Vienna, from Paris to Marseille, as Milton and Rita Golopta. In Marseille, Wilhelm is arrested and thrown in jail because of his unregistered car. However, Milton Golopta has a little bit of influence, and so he engaged a French parliamentary deputy, Mr. Diouf from Dakar, to release Wilhelm, and he gets released. Wilhelm and Goloptas take an apartment in Lisbon, and Wilhelm maintains his contact with those letters and postcards, but eventually he loses contact. In 1943, gets a visa to Canada, but he jumps ship in New York. And then he sponsors the Goloptas, and they again share an apartment on 99th Street. The interesting thing is how someone who's an illegal immigrant can go and sponsor someone else, but that's the way they did it during the Second World War, I guess. After Milton dies, Wilhelm marries Rita. So what happens to Lucy? Lucy returns to the apartment house and is hidden by Honka. However, she goes to church one day and confesses that she's doing this for a Jewish child, and the priest insists that Honka turn Lucy out. So Lucy gets papers from the underground, but unfortunately is captured in Budapest and is then sent to Auschwitz, but as a Gentile. She sent, while she was in this period of time, she sent a letter to, and this is exactly the way that this was addressed, David Goldhirsch, New York, via a stranger who was heading to Palestine, indicating that Basia is shielding Max as Lucy and her group of friends. However, Lucy perishes during the Dresden bombing, we think. We don't know for sure. There are rumors, and there's other stuff going on that I'll get to in a second. In New York, Wilhelm gets that letter from Lucy, who is now deceased, which was sent from Palestine. So the guy that she gave this letter to went to Palestine, mailed the letter to Goldhirsch in New York. Somehow it found Mr. Goldhirsch. There was no address, no street address. And then Wilhelm gets the letter, and he is delighted that his son is alive. So using his connections and the Red Cross, Wilhelm appeals to King Gustav of Sweden to help reunite with son Max. So here's the telegram that was sent by Count Bondy, the king's private secretary, and it says, William Perlmutter of 309 West 99th Street, entrance visa Sweden for Maximilian Perlmutter cannot be granted as present, but question might be reconsidered if proof given, visa other country granted or probable. Photograph of Max on a boat arriving in Sweden in 1946. And then when he reunites with his father, then there's an article in one of the newspapers in New York, which says amongst the youngest refugees landing today was Maximilian Perlmutter, 12, formerly of Warsaw, Poland, who was reunited with his father, William, of whatever the address is. During the war, the boy's mother and 14-year-old sister were cremated in a Nazi concentration camp. And then it says he escaped to Sweden, where King Gustav heard his story and helped obtain his passage to this country. Photo of Max and his father Wilhelm in 1946. Wilhelm at first could not believe that that was the same son that he left when he was 6 years old, and he was asking a million questions to try and determine the validity of Max, whether it was really his son or not. Before departing Sweden, Max, when he was 13, had an audience with King Gustav and thanked him for the help. After the war, there were some scams on Lucy. We think they're scams. We've got these letters that are written in Croatian or Slovakian language. This was a translation of it. And the sort of thing that was said here was, your daughter Lucy was accepted in my house as a respectable person, although she owned nothing, was half-starved and naked. I gave her protection, and I regret this. She seduced my husband and so on. And we believe this was a scam because no one knew what occurred with Lucy, and there was never any contact. She was lost during the war. But just to try and squeeze some money out of it, they also enclosed a list of all the items that this person had bought for Lucy, including a brassiere of 30 crowns and a pair of gloves and various other things. And there's the bill, 17,585 crowns from Slovakia. I don't know what the outcome of that was. I don't know whether any money was sent, but eventually that sort of stuff stopped. So Max's family, Max married Cindy Graubart, had two children, Marissa and Brian Pelton. And Basia's family in that period became part of their family. So they were sending care parcels and money and so forth over to the people that saved Max. And there's Basia and her husband Zygmunt after they got married after the war. There's a chance meeting at an Israel Bonds event in New York. And Max and Renya, who was one of Lucy's close friends, met by chance. Unbelievable. And of course, that was a very emotional time for Max to find out, or to at least to reminisce about Lucy. And Renya was able to do that. And not only that, but also she was married to a Schindler's List survivor. Basia is honored at Yad Vashem. So here is Monica and Kasia. Kasia is Catherine Kowalski. That's her married name now. That was the daughter of Basia, and that was the daughter of Kasia. So daughter and granddaughter were up on a plaque here, and the Righteous Gentile Medal awardee for Basia, and there it is up on the wall. Celeste, I can't pronounce that, Janya. Unfortunately, if one can remember back to 2012, there was a bad rail accident in Poland, where a train en route from Warsaw to Krakow, two trains in opposite directions on the same single line, and there was a big crash. Unfortunately, one of the 12 people that was killed was Monica. Very sad. She was a beautiful girl, unmarried at the time. In 1985, Max and the family visited Basia and her family for the first time. And when Max came to the door, Basia exclaimed in Polish, "My son has come home." So he was the nephew, her so-called nephew during the war. all this testimony, a lot of the facts that I got were recorded in a 3-hour testimony in Spielberg's Visual History Foundation. So there was a tape, and in 1998, Max made that tape. It took him that long before he even opened up to his family. They didn't even know what he went through. And eventually he came out and told the story. And I asked him how come he was so precise in his story. He said, after the age of 6, I remember everything that happened almost every day. That's how traumatic it was for him. So Max's family, 7 were out of Poland and 6 survived. 32 were trapped in Poland and only 1 survived, and that was Max. In 2003, Max and Cindy moved to Florida, and that's the end of their path. In 2004, we find each other through Jewish Gen. In 2005, we meet for the first time in Pennsylvania. And in 2006, Elaine and I moved to Florida, and so path 1 ends. So our first meeting in Pennsylvania was really exciting, because Kasia Kowalski, who is the daughter of Basha, she was with them, with Max and with Cindy and Brian as well. They were staying together on vacation or whatever it was, and that was a real thrill to be able to meet the daughter of a righteous Gentile and have her come to our house and to know them and to get to know them. We met her again in Krakow, and she pointed out the house where Max was living when he was a youngster. If I would have listened to my father, not many of us listen to our parents, but if I would have listened to my father, I would have found out that Eddie Stewart's and my father met in 1978 in London, and that was Eddie Stewart's was Simon's father, and I didn't know that, or if I did know it, I promptly forgot it or didn't care or whatever, and that's really a shame, because I could have found out about this earlier than what I did. If you look interested in genealogy, for genealogists, I've got about 2,100 names in close paternal and maternal trees of both Elaine's and my family. And for the people that are further out, there's about 10,000 names. I've kind of given that one up. The earliest one is around 1750. I use Ancestry.com and MyHeritage.com extensively. There are a lot of documents and member trees in Ancestry and also in MyHeritage. And although some of the information is suspect because it comes out of someone else's research, I figure that most of it is accurate. And then the research links and databases are all listed here, so that if someone was interested in genealogy and where did I get this information from, that's where I picked it up. So that's the story of 2 paths to Florida. And Maya Ben-Zev, Maximilian Perlmutter, Thaddeus Sarnik, or Teddy Black, and Max Pelton were all the same person. He had 4 names in his lifetime, and he went through a lot to get here. And we enjoyed ourselves. We enjoyed each other for about 8 months before he passed away. We got down in about August of 2006, and he died in March of 2007.